conversation isn't about who's right. Why understanding each other's frames matters more than winning. Two friends walk out of the same movie. One says it was brilliant, quietly devastating, full of restraint, the kind of film that stays with you. The other says it was boring, slow, self-important, a waste of 2 hours. They saw the same film. They sat next to each other. They heard the same dialogue, watched the same shots, followed the same story. And yet they came out having watched, in some meaningful sense, two different movies. This happens constantly, and not just at the movies. A couple disagrees about what was really going on at the family dinner. Two colleagues come out of the same meeting with opposite impressions of how it went. Siblings tell completely different versions of a shared childhood. Most of us have had the unsettling experience of being absolutely certain about what happened, and discovering that someone we trust, who was right there with us, remembers it differently. The conventional response to this is to decide that someone must be wrong, someone wasn't paying attention, someone is remembering selectively, someone has an axe to grind. We turn the disagreement into a problem of accuracy, whose perception tracks reality, and whose is distorted. And so we argue, we marshal evidence, we try to convince. Sometimes we win, sometimes we lose. And either way, we usually walk away feeling that the other person didn't really see what was obviously there. There's another explanation, and it's more interesting than anyone being wrong. It turns out that the idea of two people simply seeing what happened and comparing notes afterward is not quite how perception works. What each of those friends experienced in the theater wasn't a recording of the movie. It was something their brain made. This is where the neuroscience gets genuinely surprising, because most of us spend our lives under the assumption that our experience of the world is a kind of transparent window onto reality. Light enters your eyes, sound enters your ears, and your brain delivers you a faithful rendering of what's out there. You see what's there. You hear what was said. Your experience is, roughly speaking, a recording with minor interpretive touches. It isn't. Your brain is doing something much stranger and much more active than that. At every moment, it's generating a prediction about what the world should look like, based on your past experience, your expectations, your current mood, your attentional focus, and then comparing that prediction to the sensory information streaming in from your eyes and ears and skin. What you actually experience consciously is not the raw sensory input. It's the brain's best current guess, informed heavily by what it expected to find. Most of the time, this works so smoothly you never notice. Your brain's predictions are usually close enough to reality that the construction feels like direct perception. But it's construction all the way down. The evidence for this is everywhere once you know where to look. Optical illusions work because they exploit the prediction machinery. The same room feels different when you're in a good mood than when you're anxious, even though nothing about the room has changed. Two people in the same conversation can walk away with different memories of what was said because their brains were attending to different things, running different predictions, filling in different gaps. The brain has to work this way. Sensory information is too ambiguous, too incomplete, and arrives too slowly for raw perception to be viable. If your brain waited for complete information before generating experience, you'd be hopelessly behind the world. So it predicts, it fills in, it constructs. The experience you live inside is the output of that construction process, not the raw material feeding into it. The answer has to do with something we might call your frame, though it's not a limitation or a cage. It's more like the particular shape your brain has taken through a lifetime of use. Here's what happens as you grow up. Your brain starts with far more neural connections than it will ever need, a lavish overabundance of possible pathways. But as you go through life, having experiences, paying attention to some things and not others, practicing certain skills and neglecting others, a pruning process begins. The connections that get used regularly grow stronger. The ones that don't get used gradually weaken and fade. Over time, this sculpts your brain into a unique configuration, not by adding something new, but by strengthening some pathways while letting others wither. Your frame is the accumulated result of this pruning. It's shaped by what you've practiced, the language patterns you internalized growing up, the skills you developed, the problems you learned to solve. It's shaped by what you've attended to, the details you've trained yourself to notice, the patterns you've gotten good at recognizing. It's shaped by the narratives you've absorbed about how the world works, what matters, what's possible. And it's shaped by the experiences that marked you, the moments that taught you what to expect from people, situations, yourself. This frame isn't your personality exactly, though it influences your personality. It's more like the particular lens through which your brain processes information. It determines what you notice first in a new situation, what feels familiar or strange, what seems obviously important or irrelevant. When your brain is constructing your experience from expectations plus sensory input, your frame is what's providing the expectations. Everyone has a frame. This isn't a judgment or a flaw. It's just how brains work. You can't have a lifetime of experience without that experience leaving traces in your neural architecture. The person who frustrates you, the person who sees the world so differently from you, is working from their frame just as you're working from yours. They're not choosing to be obtuse or difficult. They're constructing their experience through the neural pathways that got strengthened by their particular history, which leads to something that's both humbling and useful to know. When you step back and look at humans as a species, we're remarkably similar. We share roughly 99.9% of our DNA. We have essentially identical brain architectures, the same regions, the same major neural highways, the same basic sensory and motor systems. If you pick two people at random from anywhere in the world, the similarities would vastly outweigh the differences. We have the same capacity for language, the same emotional repertoire, the same fundamental ways of learning and remembering and planning. This shared substrate is why you can have a conversation with another person at all. It's why two people watching the same movie are both seeing images and following a plot, even if they interpret it differently. The 99.9% similarity means that your construction process and theirs are running on the same underlying machinery. You're both human brains making human sense of human experience. But here's the paradox. That 0.1% of difference isn't trivial. It's the accumulation of every choice about what to pay attention to, every skill you developed or didn't develop, every narrative you internalized, every experience that left its mark on how your neural pathways got configured. It's small in absolute terms, but it's also what makes you uniquely you, instead of your neighbor. For conversation, this creates an interesting situation. The 99.9% similarity is what makes communication possible. You're both constructing from similar enough raw materials that your experiences can overlap. But the 0.1% difference is what the conversation is usually really about. When you disagree with someone, you're typically not disagreeing about the basic facts of human experience. You're bumping up against the small but meaningful differences in how your respective frames are constructing meaning from those facts. A study published earlier this year in Nature Human Behavior looked at brain scans from over 12,000 people to understand how the brain produces behavior. The researchers were investigating something that neuroscientists have long taken for granted, that for any given mental ability, say executive function or language processing, there's a specific network of brain connections responsible for that ability. The executive function network, the language network. The idea is that if you can identify the strongest connections associated with a particular behavior, you've found the neural basis for that behavior. So the researchers did what neuroscientists typically do. They measured the strength of roughly 35,000 connections in each person's brain, correlated each connection with the behavior they wanted to predict, and ranked them from strongest to weakest association. Then they kept the top 10%, the connections most strongly linked to the behavior, and discarded the rest as noise. But they decided to try something else. Instead of throwing away the bottom 90% of connections, they built predictive models from those discarded connections to see what would happen. The assumption was that these weaker connections would be much worse at predicting behavior. After all, if they were important, they would have shown up in the top 10%, right? They weren't worse. The connections that get routinely discarded as noise predicted behavior just as accurately as the supposedly important ones. But here's the crucial finding. They implicated entirely different brain networks. The top connection suggested that executive function depends on communication between visual and frontal brain regions. The discarded connection suggested it depends on coordination between default mode and salience networks. Same behavioral outcome, completely different underlying neural story. Think about two people, call them Alice and Bob. Both take a cognitive test requiring them to hold information in mind, switch between rules, and inhibit automatic responses. Both score similarly, competent, roughly average performance. On paper, they look like two instances of the same cognitive ability. But inside their brains, the work is getting done differently. Bob's brain fits the conventional story. His executive function runs primarily through the connections that show up as important in typical neuroscience studies. Strong coupling between frontal and visual regions, the pathways that get written up in textbooks as the executive function network. A predictive model built from those top-ranked connections captures Bob's performance accurately. Alice scores just as well as Bob, but her brain is telling a different story. The connections that work so well for predicting Bob's performance don't capture Alice's at all. Her executive function is running through a distributed set of connections that individually seemed unimportant, weak correlations that got discarded as noise in the standard analysis. But collectively, those connections predict her cognitive performance just as accurately as Bob's more conventional neural signature. This means something concrete for how Alice and Bob experience thinking. When they sit down to tackle a complex problem, they're not just using different strategies, they're running different neural processes entirely. Bob might experience executive function as a kind of focused visual spatial coordination. Alice might experience it as a more intuitive background monitoring process. When they compare notes about how they approach difficult cognitive tasks, they'll describe genuinely different experiences, not because one of them is wrong about their own thinking, but because their frames, their specific neural configurations, are literally implementing the same cognitive outcome through different pathways. And this happens not despite their competence, but as a normal feature of how human brains work. There isn't one correct way for a brain to do executive function. There are many ways, most of them invisible to standard analysis because they don't fit the assumption that important brain functions should be carried by the strongest, most obvious connections. Most arguments aren't actually about truth, they're about construction. When Alice and Bob disagree about the best approach to a project, or when those two friends walk out of the movie with opposite reactions, the conventional response is to treat it as a problem of accuracy. Someone is seeing the situation correctly and someone isn't. The goal becomes to establish who's right, to marshal evidence, point out what the other person is missing, convince them they've gotten something wrong. But if consciousness is constructed, and if people can reach different reasonable conclusions from the same information because they're running different construction processes, then most everyday disagreements aren't about who's perceiving reality correctly. They're about whose frame is in play. Alice and Bob aren't necessarily disagreeing about the facts of the project. They're bringing different construction processes to bear on those facts. Different attention patterns, different narrative frameworks, different ways of organizing information that reflect their different neural configurations. This changes everything about how to have the conversation. Instead of trying to convince Bob that Alice's conclusion is correct or vice versa, the conversation becomes an exploration of how each person is constructing their view. The question shifts from who's right to how are you seeing this? The goal isn't to win or to establish truth. It's to make both construction processes visible so that each person understands not just what the other person thinks, but how they're thinking. This requires a different set of questions and a different kind of curiosity. Instead of asking, "Don't you see that?" or "How can you possibly think?" you start asking questions designed to illuminate the other person's frame. What are you noticing that I might be missing? This isn't a rhetorical question designed to prove they're not noticing anything important. It's genuine curiosity about what their attention is drawn to, what their construction process is highlighting as significant. What's the story you're telling yourself about this situation? Everyone has a narrative running in the background that organizes the information into a coherent picture. Alice might be operating from a story about tight deadlines and the need for quick action. Bob might be working from a story about quality control and the importance of getting things right the first time. Neither story is wrong, but they lead to different conclusions about what to prioritize. What experiences are you bringing to how you're seeing this? Bob's caution about the project might be informed by a previous project that went badly when the team moved too fast. Alice's urgency might reflect her experience that teams lose momentum when they deliberate too long. Those experiences aren't just background context. They're actively shaping how each person's brain is predicting what will happen and what matters. What would need to be true for your interpretation to make sense? This is a way of asking the person to make their assumptions explicit. Often, people are reasoning from premises that feel so obvious they don't think to state them. Making those premises visible helps you understand the logic of their construction, even if you don't share their starting points. But here's the crucial reciprocal move. You also have to make your own construction visible. Most people are willing to explain their thinking if they feel the other person is doing the same. Here's what I'm noticing. Here's the story I'm running. Here's what I'm bringing to this from past experience. Here's what I'm assuming. This isn't weakness or indecision. It's modeling the kind of conversation you're trying to have. The goal isn't to agree. Sometimes exploring each other's frames reveals that the disagreement was based on different information or different assumptions, and the conversation resolves naturally. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes Alice and Bob understand each other's construction perfectly and still prefer different approaches. That's fine. Now they're disagreeing about something real, about values, priorities, risk tolerance, rather than talking past each other. More importantly, they're disagreeing in a way that respects the other person's competence. Bob isn't frustrated that Alice doesn't see the obvious risks. He understands that Alice's construction process, shaped by her specific neural configuration and history, is highlighting different aspects of the situation as important. Alice isn't annoyed that Bob is being overly cautious. She recognizes that Bob's frame is generating legitimate concerns that she might be missing. There's something else that happens when you approach conversation this way. You start to notice your own frame more clearly. When you have to articulate what you're noticing, what story you're telling yourself, what experiences you're drawing on, you become more conscious of your own construction process. You start to see the ways your attention gets directed, the narratives you default to, the assumptions you don't usually examine. And you start to realize that your frame, useful as it is, isn't the only way to construct reality from the available information. Other people's frames aren't obstacles to overcome or flaws to correct. They're different solutions to the problem of making sense of the world, shaped by different histories and optimized for different challenges. For people who want more structure for thinking about how frames differ, there are frameworks that can help, but only if you use them carefully. Take something like Myers-Briggs, or the Jungian cognitive functions that inspired it. These systems describe patterns in how people process information. Some people naturally start with concrete details and build up to patterns, while others see the big picture first and work down to specifics. Some people make decisions by analyzing logical relationships, others by considering how different options affect people and values. These aren't arbitrary categories, they're descriptions of real differences in how people's construction processes tend to operate. Used well, these frameworks function as a kind of grammar for describing what you observe about someone's frame. You might notice that Alice tends to construct understanding by extrapolating from patterns and possibilities, while Bob tends to build from concrete facts and direct experience. That's useful information. It helps you understand why Alice gets excited about the implications of the project while Bob wants to nail down the logistics first. It explains why Alice finds Bob's approach overly narrow while Bob finds Alice's approach insufficiently grounded. But there's a dangerous way to use these frameworks, and it's unfortunately common. The grammar becomes a label. I'm an INTJ, so I'm not good with emotions. She's a sensor, so she doesn't see the big picture. He's a feeler, so he can't make objective decisions. The framework stops being a tool for understanding how someone's construction process works and becomes a frame that limits what they think they can do or become. This is backwards. The point of understanding your construction process isn't to accept it as fixed reality. It's to recognize how you currently organize information so you can work with that process more deliberately and expand it when useful. Which brings us to something important about frames. They're not permanent. The same neuroplasticity that built your frame keeps it changeable throughout your life. Your frame is the accumulated result of pruning, connections strengthened by practice and experience, others weakened by disuse. But that process never stops. Every time you deliberately attend to something new, practice an unfamiliar skill, or work to understand a different perspective, you're influencing which connections get reinforced and which ones get developed. The person who frustrates you today, by approaching problems so differently from you, may be actively expanding their construction process in ways you can't see. This doesn't mean you can instantly rewire yourself to think like someone else, or that personality differences are just a matter of insufficient effort. The patterns carved by decades of experience run deep. But it does mean that understanding your frame gives you leverage over how it develops. If you recognize that you tend to construct understanding by focusing on logical analysis rather than relational dynamics, that's not a life sentence. It's information about where you have natural strength and where you might choose to develop additional capacity. The key insight is that understanding your construction process is the first step to expanding it, not the final word on who you are. When Alice realizes that her natural pattern is to scan for possibilities while Bob naturally grounds in present facts, she's not discovering her limitations. She's discovering the particular cognitive strength she brings to any collaboration, and potentially identifying capacities she might want to develop to communicate more effectively with people whose frames work differently. This is why the conversation approach we've been discussing matters beyond just getting along with people. When you become curious about how someone else constructs reality, you're not just being diplomatic. You're exposing yourself to a different way of organizing information, attending to details, solving problems. Some of that exposure stays with you. Your own frame becomes a little more flexible, a little more capable of seeing situations from angles that wouldn't have occurred to you before. Bob doesn't have to become Alice to benefit from understanding how Alice's construction process works. Spending time genuinely trying to understand her perspective, not to defeat it or to prove his own point, but to see how her frame generates different insights from the same information, changes how Bob approaches problems in the future. His own construction process expands, The same thing happens to Alice. The goal isn't for both of them to end up thinking identically. It's for both of them to become more aware of their own construction processes and more capable of recognizing and learning from different ones. Go back to those two friends walking out of the movie theater. One thinks the film was brilliant, the other thinks it was boring. In the old frame, this is a problem to be solved. One of them is wrong. One of them missed what was obviously there, or saw something that wasn't really there. The conversation becomes a kind of forensic exercise, reviewing the evidence, pointing out what the other person overlooked, building a case for the correct interpretation. But now we can see what's actually happening. Two brains, 99.9% identical in their basic architecture, constructed two different experiences from the same sequence of images and sounds, not because one of them malfunctioned, but because their frames, their accumulated histories of attention, experience, and practice, brought different expectations to what they watched. One person's construction process highlighted the film's restraint and subtext. The other's construction process registered that same restraint as emptiness. Neither construction is wrong. They're different. The conversation they could have now is entirely different. Instead of debating whether the film was actually good or actually boring, they could explore how each person's frame generated their experience. What was each person attending to? What stories were they telling themselves about what good films do? What experiences were they drawing on to make sense of what they watched? This isn't a polite way to avoid disagreement. It's a recognition that the disagreement was never about the film. It was about two construction processes meeting, two different ways of organizing the same information into meaning. Understanding that doesn't eliminate the difference in their reactions, but it transforms what the difference means and how they can talk about it. The shift from who's right to how are you seeing this changes something fundamental about conversation. You're no longer defending your truth against theirs. You're two people with nearly identical brains that got configured differently through different histories, trying to understand how each other thinks. That conversation, that mutual exploration of frames, is where real communication happens. And something else shifts too, something you might not expect. When you stop trying to win conversations and start trying to understand them, you begin to see your own construction process more clearly. You start to notice what you habitually attend to, what narratives you default to, what assumptions you carry without examining. You realize that your way of seeing, however natural it feels to you, is just one way among many, shaped by your specific history, useful for some purposes, limited in others. The people around you stop being obstacles to convince or problems to solve. They become windows into different ways of organizing reality from the same human substrate. Your own frame becomes visible and therefore workable. You discover that the 0.1% that makes each person unique isn't a barrier to understanding. It's the most interesting part of any conversation.